He had lived in those mountains long enough to recognize when the land tried to speak, even if its voice came only through a shift in the wind or the faint echo of something out of place. The winter of 1884 pressed hard against northern Montana, sinking the valleys into deep silence and leaving the pines heavy under a burden of snow. Callahan Reed spent most of his days moving through that silence with the calm certainty of a man who knew every ridge and shadow of the Bitterroot Wilderness. The solitude did not trouble him. It had shaped him, steadied him, and become as familiar as the worn handle of the rifle he carried. His cabin stood on a small rise above the tree line, built from pine logs darkened by years of storms. Smoke curled from the chimney each morning as the sky paled behind the jagged mountains, and by evening the scent of burning wood lingered like a second skin over the clearing. Callahan's life unfolded in the rhythm of those quiet hours, checking traps, tracking elk through the powdery drifts, cutting firewood before nightfall. There were no surprises here, no sudden changes, only the predictable movements of winter, slow and heavy as a great sleeping animal. But that evening, the first fracture appeared. He noticed it while following a deer trail that wound along the frozen creek. The fading light sharpened the edges of the snow, revealing impressions that did not belong to him or any creature native to those woods. Small footprints broke the pristine surface, delicate but hurried. The stride length was uneven, marked by stumbles, as if the person had been running in exhaustion rather than fear. He crouched beside the prints, letting the cold air sting his lungs, and studied the path they carved into the forest. They came from nowhere recognizable, no mountain path, no road, no camp, only the deep woods. A scrap of fabric had caught on a low branch near the water. A strip of blue ribbon, torn and stiff with ice, fluttered faintly in the wind. He held it between his gloved fingers, feeling its fragility. It belonged to someone who did not belong here. No traveler ventured this far north in winter without reason, and certainly not a woman alone. The ribbon held no story he could read, yet it unsettled him, stirring something long dormant. He pocketed it and followed the trail a short distance until the fading prints disappeared into the shadows. The forest swallowed the last clues as night began to fall. The cold thickened, pressing against his skin through layers of wool. He turned back toward home, carrying with him the sense that the mountains had shifted, disturbed by an event he did not yet understand. The hours slipped toward darkness as he reached the clearing. A pale band of sky hung over the horizon, but the cold had sharpened and the wind began to scrape through the branches like a dull whisper. Inside the cabin, the fire glowed in the hearth, casting a low amber light against the rough walls. He warmed his hands briefly, then stepped back outside, drawn by an instinct he could not name. There was something in the night air, an unease that made him listen more closely than usual. The snow muffled nearly all sound, yet he caught the faintest rustle, distant and irregular. A figure moved between the trees, first barely visible, then emerging into the open clearing with staggering steps. She looked like a ghost carried by the storm, her dress torn, her coat hanging loosely from one shoulder, her hair tangled and rimmed with frost. Each step seemed uncertain, as if her body fought the cold with the last scraps of strength. Callahan stood perfectly still, watching her approach. She did not see him at first. Her gaze was unfocused, fixed somewhere beyond the cabin, as though she walked toward an imagined place rather than the one before her. The snow dragged at her feet, and her shoulders trembled with exhaustion. When she finally lifted her eyes, it was only for a second before her legs buckled and she collapsed into the snow. For a moment, everything went silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. The sight of her lying there, fragile, freezing, alone, tore through the calm structure of his life like a sudden storm. There was no question of leaving her. The wilderness was unforgiving, and Dawn would never find her alive if she remained in the snow. He crossed the distance quickly, his boots crunching through the layer of ice, and lifted her into his arms. She felt weightless, chilled to the bone, her breath shallow against his chest. Her clothes were soaked with melted frost, and her skin burned cold through the fabric. He carried her inside the cabin, pushing the door shut with his shoulder, sealing out the night. The warmth of the fire met them immediately, wrapping around her still form, turning the frost on her hair into beads of water that slid slowly down her temples. Callahan laid her near the hearth, covering her with blankets, placing his coat around her shoulders. Her face, pale and shadowed, bore signs of a long struggle. Scratches along her cheek, red marks where cold had bitten the skin, a faint bruise near her jaw. She looked both delicate and resolute, as if some deep will had carried her farther than her body could endure. While tending to her, he glanced again at the ribbon in his pocket. It matched the fabric of the torn strip tangled in her hair, the same shade of blue, a single detail connecting the footprints in the snow, the distant forest, and this stranger now breathing unevenly before his fire. He understood then that her arrival was not a random accident of the winter. Someone like her did not wander into these mountains without a story carved into every trembling breath. Something had driven her here, through cold that could kill within an hour, across a wilderness only the desperate or the hunted dared to cross. As the fire crackled softly and her breathing steadied little by little, the weight of responsibility settled quietly onto his shoulders. The solitude he had guarded for years was gone the moment she fell at his doorstep. The mountains had brought her to him, and whether he wished it or not, her fate was now tied to his. Outside, the night deepened, spreading its dark wings over the forest. But inside the small cabin, something new had begun, fragile, uncertain, and irreversible. She woke in the muted warmth of the cabin, her breath shallow, her thoughts drifting between memory and confusion. The fire cast a soft glow across the rough-hewn walls, and the scent of pine resin lingered in the air. For a long moment, she simply lay still, feeling the weight of exhaustion in her limbs. Her name was Eloise Vance, though the silence of the wilderness made it feel like a distant title rather than something that belonged to her. She had fled from a future forced upon her, a marriage arranged by her uncle for the sake of influence and fortune. The men he had sent after her knew the forest only well enough to chase, not to understand it. And she had wandered too long, letting fear guide her steps until her strength abandoned her. Callahan moved quietly through the space, his presence both grounding and distant, like a figure carved out of the land itself. He studied her without intrusion, noticing the way her fingers trembled when she tried to sit upright, the pallor beneath her cheeks, and the faint bruises along her wrists that told a story she had not voiced. She looked nothing like someone meant for these wild northern woods, yet beneath the fragile surface lay a resilience that had carried her through bitter wind and drifting snow, a force that had pushed her to run when surrender might have been easier. She tried to hide the truth behind formal composure and careful words, but small things betrayed her past. A note she had clutched in the pocket of her tattered coat bore an elegant, practiced handwriting. The remnants of her cloak were made from fabric far too fine for the frontier. Even the chain at her neck broken where it once held a signet ring, spoke of wealth and lineage. She did not see how clearly these fragments revealed her story, but Callahan read them as one might read the forest floor after a fresh snow. He asked nothing. The silence between them served as its own kind of refuge, a space where she could gather herself without fear of interrogation. She sensed that he understood more than he let on, and the steadiness in his gaze eased a tension she had carried since the day she fled. As the days passed, Eloise began to move through the cabin with deliberate purpose, offering small helps where she could. She folded blankets, tended to the fire, swept the pine needles carried in by the wind. Though her gestures were simple, they stitched her presence into the quiet rhythm of his life. She watched Callahan as he worked, noticing the precision with which he cleaned his tools and the way he stepped outside each morning to survey the tree line as if expecting trouble to rise out of the mist. There was a gravity to him, a stern discipline shaped by solitude and harsh seasons. His silence was not cold, but protective, a shield forged from years spent relying only on himself. Eloise found herself drawn to that steadiness, to the way he seemed rooted to the land, untouched by the schemes and demands of the world she had escaped. But within those log walls, a fragile, wordless bond had begun to form, shaping their shared days in ways neither yet understood. The winter deepened, tightening its grip on the mountains until the world beyond the cabin seemed to vanish beneath a curtain of wind and white. Snow drifted high against the outer walls, and each morning the silence felt heavier, as if the wilderness itself listened to their every movement. Days stretched longer in the dim light, and nights came sharper, pressing them inside the small circle of warmth cast by the fire. Their routines intertwined, not by choice, but by the inevitability of shared isolation. Callahan noticed how Eloise adapted to this harsh land with a determination that surprised even her. She learned to coax flames from stubborn kindling, her fingers no longer trembling from cold, but steady with purpose. She hung damp clothes near the hearth and checked them with a practiced touch. Outside, she followed the narrow trails around the clearing, her steps cautious at first and then growing sure, tracing patterns across the snow that grew more confident with each passing day. When the clouds parted after a storm, she studied the sky, learning to find direction by the bright winter constellations that hovered above the jagged silhouette of the Bitterroot Range. In these quiet hours, Callahan often watched her from a distance, observing how the forest slowly stripped away the remnants of the life she had fled. The fine edges of her former world softened, replaced by a resilience that fit naturally into the severe beauty around them. She moved differently now, with purpose rather than fear, and the wilderness responded by welcoming her steps rather than swallowing them. But as her confidence grew, so did the shadow that haunted the edges of their world. One morning, while checking the perimeter after a night of heavy snowfall, Callahan noticed unfamiliar impressions pressed into the powder. They were large and deliberate, the stride long, the weight unmistakably that of a man accustomed to long distances. The tracks did not belong to a hunter or trapper, nor had they been shifted by the wandering of an animal. Someone had come searching. He stood over the marks for a long moment, snowflakes settling on his shoulders, knowing that nothing good could be drawn from their presence. The forest was too vast, too unforgiving for strangers to wander here without reason. When he returned to the cabin, the expression on his face told Eloise everything before he spoke a word. The truth escaped her in fragments at first, a tremor in her breath, a tightening in her posture. But then the weight of what she carried became too heavy to hide. She admitted that she had been hunted since the night she fled her uncle's estate. that the men sent after her were not bound by laws or conscience. They had been instructed to retrieve her by whatever means necessary, to drag her back to the future she had risked everything to escape. Callahan felt something shift inside him, a quiet acceptance that the peaceful life he had carved from the wilderness could no longer remain untouched. The solitude he had embraced for years was already gone, replaced by a responsibility he had not sought but could not refuse. The threat pressing in from the forest was no longer just hers, it was theirs. Eloise saw the tension settle across his shoulders, the way his gaze moved toward the door as if measuring the distance between safety and danger. She apologized, her voice soft, carrying the fear that she had brought ruin into his life. She believed she had upset a delicate balance, turning his sanctuary into a battleground, and the thought hollowed her. Yet beneath that fear lay something deeper, something neither of them had fully acknowledged. They had grown accustomed to each other's presence, to the quiet exchanges, the shared tasks, the steady rhythm of two lives moving in the same confined space. The connection between them had taken root in silence, in moments as simple as tending the fire or stepping out onto the porch to listen to the wind. Callahan felt it too, in the way her steps had become familiar, in the way her presence softened the edges of his solitary world. The danger closing in only made that bond more undeniable. Whatever uncertainty lay ahead, he could no more turn her away than sever a part of himself. Outside, the storm gathered once more over the mountains, the wind carrying with it the promise of harsh nights and the approach of those who sought her. But inside the cabin, something steadier than fear held them together. A quiet thread woven through their days, like the deep, cold waters of the Bitterroot River beneath its winter ice.
The evening settled into a dim stillness, the cabin lit only by the slow pulse of the fire smoldering in the hearth. Outside, the storm that had raged for hours softened without warning, its howling winds fading into a silence so absolute it felt unnatural. Callahan paused in his movements, sensing the shift the way animals sense the approach of a predator. The air held its breath, even the trees seemed to wait. He moved toward the shuttered window, placing his shoulder against the log wall as he listened. The faint crack of a branch reached him through the quiet, distant yet deliberate. It was the kind of sound that did not belong to the wilderness on a night when even the snow had grown still. It was the sound of weight, of an intruder disturbing the fragile surface of the frozen woods. He knew then that the night had changed shape, that it had become something sharp-edged and dangerous. Peering through the narrow crack between the shutters, he caught the subtle shift of shadow against the whiteness of the clearing. 3 figures moved at the tree line, barely visible but unmistakably human, stepping through the snow with a caution sharpened by experience. They carried themselves with purpose, not fear, as though the wilderness existed merely as an obstacle between them and what they had been sent to retrieve. Their shoulders were squared, their heads angled toward the cabin with the confidence of men certain of their mission. Behind him, Eloise stood near the hearth, clutching the edges of her shawl. The firelight carved soft lines across her face, revealing a tremor in her features she tried to steady. She sensed their presence even before she fully understood it. The silence outside pressed against the walls, and her breath hitched as she realized the storm had given them cover to draw closer. The fear in her eyes was real, but beneath it lay something firmer, an unyielding thread of resolve that had only grown since she first stepped into this isolated refuge. Callahan's awareness sharpened. He recognized then that the fragile peace they had lived in was gone. He was no longer simply providing shelter for a lost traveler. He had become the boundary between her and the men determined to take her back by force. Whatever solitude he had guarded all these years had already unraveled, replaced by a responsibility that reached beyond instinct or duty. It wrapped itself into something deeper, something he could not abandon. Outside, the figures advanced with slow precision. Snow muffled their footsteps, but he felt their presence like a tightening cord. He stepped away from the window, moving silently through the cabin as he checked the shadows, the corners, the latch on the door. His movements were deliberate, calm. Eloise watched him, her breathing uneven, caught between terror and trust. She knew she had set this danger upon his home, yet she also knew she could not face it alone. Callahan's silence told her more than words ever could. He had chosen to stand between her and the darkness beyond the walls. The night stretched into a tense vigil. The men outside circled the cabin with a predatory caution, testing the defenses, listening for weaknesses. Their boots pressed deep into the snow, their outlines shifting like specters against the dim light of the moon. Callahan positioned himself near the door, every muscle attuned to the faintest disturbance. His breath was steady, though each inhale felt heavy with the weight of the moment. Eloise stayed close to the fire, her eyes fixed on the entrance, her hands clasped tightly, as if holding herself together. Long minutes passed, with only the soft creak of settling wood and the distant sigh of wind pushing loose snow across the roof. Then a scrape sounded near the corner of the cabin, followed by the hushed murmur of movement. Callahan stiffened, tightening his grip on the tools he kept close at hand. The forest seemed to lean in, waiting for the clash it knew was coming. When the attack came, it was quick and forceful, a burst of violence against the fragile structure that had sheltered them. The door rattled under pressure, the shutters shivered in their frames, and shadows lunged across the walls. Callahan met the assault with swift, controlled strength, using the advantage of the confined space and the element of defense. The cabin groaned with the strain, but each surge was pushed back with unyielding resolve. Snow swirled in the air where the shutters opened briefly in the struggle, catching the moonlight in a cascade of pale sparks before dissolving into the cold wood. The night outside pulsed with frantic movement, then slowly retreated as the attackers realized the house would not be taken so easily. One by one, the figures withdrew, melting into the trees with growing frustration rather than defeat. When silence returned, it felt heavier than before. Callahan stood in the doorway, breathing hard, his gaze scanning the darkness where the men had disappeared. The threat had not ended, it had merely stepped back to gather strength. Eloise watched him, her heart pounding, knowing that this was only the beginning. He understood it too. The men would come again, and next time, they would not leave empty-handed unless he stood between them and their target with everything he had left to give.
The decision settled between them with the first pale hint of dawn, a quiet understanding born from the tension of the night before. Callahan knew that waiting in the cabin meant surrendering the advantage to the men who stalked them through the forest. The cabin, once his refuge, had become a target. The only way forward was through the wilderness that separated them from the nearest touch of law. At sunrise, with the snow still whispering across the clearing, he prepared their supplies with precise, efficient movements. Eloise bundled herself against the cold, her breath forming pale clouds in the air as she stepped outside to join him. The sky was a muted gray, the mountains looming like silent judges over their uncertain journey. They left the cabin behind without looking back, following a narrow trail that wound through drifts of deepening snow. The forest remained hushed, its silence layered with tension. Callahan moved ahead, breaking a path through the frost-crusted surface, while Eloise kept close behind, her steps careful but determined. She sensed the danger that still clung to the shadows, the lingering presence of the men who had retreated but had not given up their pursuit. Each shift in a wind carried an echo of the threat they left behind, and each creak of frozen branches felt like a warning. The trail led them into steep terrain where icy ridges cut across the mountainside. Eloise struggled at times, her boots slipping on hidden layers of frost, but Callahan was always there, steady and wordless, offering a hand or slowing his pace so she could match his stride. She had never traveled through such harsh country, yet she felt strangely protected, as if the wilderness itself recognized the bond forming between them. His presence wrapped around her like a shield, grounded in a calm strength she had not known in those who once claimed authority over her life. As they crossed the frozen river, the ice groaned beneath their weight. Callahan tested each step before allowing Eloise to follow. His awareness sharpened with each sound, each gust of wind that rattled loose snow across the surface. She watched him with growing comprehension, realizing that beneath his quiet exterior lived an instinct honed by years of survival. It was not violence that shaped him, but the ability to endure, to protect, to face danger without hesitation. In the fragile quiet of the crossing, she understood what it meant to trust someone not with convenience, but with her safety, her future, her hope. The day stretched into long miles, the forest opening gradually into rolling fields blanketed by untouched snow. Smoke from distant chimneys rose in thin, wavering lines against the sky. The town of Montron appeared at the foot of the final ridge, a cluster of buildings softened by winter light. As they approached, Eloise felt her pulse quicken, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what awaited her inside its borders. Her past, her name, her inheritance, all of it had been twisted into a trap by the uncle who once controlled her life. Now, at Callahan's side, she walked toward the possibility of reclaiming it. Within the sheriff's office, the truth unfolded piece by piece under the scrutiny of law. Evidence came in the form of forged signatures, falsified contracts, swollen accounts, and testimonies from townsfolk who had long suspected her uncle's dealings but had lacked the courage to speak out. Callahan stood close, silent but unwavering, his presence lending weight to every detail Eloise revealed. The sheriff, faced with the accumulation of undeniable proof, moved swiftly. Warrants were issued. Men traveled to neighboring districts. By the next morning, the uncle's web of influence began to collapse. Word spread quickly through Montron. The hired men, realizing their immunity had vanished with their employer's downfall, disappeared into the farthest edges of the state, leaving no trail behind. They were no longer hunters, but fugitives, chased now by the same law they had once ignored. Eloise felt the chains around her loosen with every passing hour, the burden of fear replaced by the startling lightness of freedom. For the first time since she fled, she could breathe without glancing over her shoulder. Yet as she stood near the edge of town, watching snow drift along the rooftops, another weight settled quietly upon her. The question of what came next hovered over her like a shifting storm. She was free, but freedom opened a vast, unfamiliar road. Her life of estates, expectations, and inherited roles lay shattered behind her. The wilderness offered a different path, but it was one shaped by choice, not obligation. She turned toward Callahan, who stood a few steps away, watching the distant mountains with the same thoughtful stillness he carried everywhere. She saw in him the man who had sheltered her, guided her, and stood between her and death without asking for anything in return. The cold air tightened around them, but in her chest, something warm and certain began to form, rising with the realization that the future she sought no longer existed alone.
The months unfolded quietly, marked first by the slow retreat of winter and then by the soft return of color to the valley. Snow melted along the rooftops of Montron, dripping into narrow streams that wound their way toward the open fields. The mountains of Bitterroot shed their white armor, revealing slopes of deep green and the dark lines of trees waking from the long cold. As spring approached, the land seemed to breathe again, stretching beneath a gentler sky. Eloise returned along the familiar trail leading toward Callahan's cabin, her steps steady, her heart calm in a way she had never known in the life she left behind. The journey no longer felt like an escape. It felt like a homecoming. Months before, she had crossed the same river, trembling from exhaustion and fear. Now she walked with certainty, carrying with her the knowledge that the house waiting ahead held more than shelter.
It held the man who had given her safety, dignity, and the quiet assurance of belonging. The cabin appeared at the curve of the trail, standing firm against the wind that brushed through the pines. Its logs glowed with the warm light of late afternoon. Something had changed inside it. The place once shaped entirely by Callahan's solitude now showed traces of her presence. A curtain she had sewn from spare cloth, a polished shelf holding the few books she had salvaged, a woven throw draped over the chair where she liked to sit by the fire. The home felt fuller, softened by her touch, yet still grounded in the rugged calm that belonged to him. Callahan met her at the doorway with a quiet expression, one that carried a depth she learned to read over the passing seasons. The sternness that had once shielded him from the world had eased. Where silence used to guard his thoughts, now it welcomed her. He had not transformed dramatically. He had simply opened, allowing the warmth she brought to settle beside the strength he carried. The days lengthened. They worked side by side, tending to the small garden at the edge of the clearing, repairing the fencing near the woods, and preparing for the unpredictable weather of early spring. Eloise found joy in tasks she once never imagined doing, hanging linens to dry in the wind, gathering herbs in the afternoon light, sweeping the floor while the scent of pine filled the air. The weight of her former life fell away, replaced by a grounded rhythm that made each day feel like an honest step forward. As spring deepened, subtle changes began within her, fatigue that lingered, an unfamiliar flutter of awareness in her body, a softness in her expression she could not hide from herself. She felt it first as a quiet secret, a delicate truth forming at the center of her being. She waited before speaking, wanting to hold it gently, wanting the moment of revelation to become something she would remember long after the seasons changed again. Callahan noticed before she found the courage to tell him. He watched the way her hands drifted unconsciously toward her abdomen, the stillness that overtook her at sunrise when she sat on the porch steps, the tenderness in her breath as though she listened for something only she could feel. He said nothing at first, as was his nature, but something softened in his gaze, a recognition blooming in the silence between them. The evening he understood, he stood beside her at the threshold, watching the sky burn gold above the Bitterroot Range. The light reflected across her face, illuminating the quiet joy she carried. He felt the warmth expand within the home behind them, filling the space with an unspoken promise. The world outside remained vast and unpredictable, but within these walls a future had begun to form, steady, fragile, and radiant. They stood together on the porch as the sun dipped below the mountains, the air cooling around them. Callahan remained like the guardian he had always been, grounded and unyielding. Eloise stood beside him as the heart of everything they had built, her presence turning the cabin from a refuge into a true home. The horizon opened before them with all its unknowns, yet for the first time, the uncertainty did not bring fear, it brought hope. Their lives were no longer defined by flight or danger, but by the quiet strength of two people choosing the same path. As dusk settled, wrapping the mountains in soft shadow, they faced the coming days with a deep shared happiness, knowing that the new life growing within her would soon join the world shaped by their courage and tenderness. If you want to hear more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel.